By the time the visionary new VP told me AI could replace my job, I'd been living inside that plant's guts for 26 years and I knew its heartbeat better than my own. The place was called North Ridge Nutraceuticals on the brochures, all green leaves and smiling joggers, but inside it was concrete, stainless steel, and the slow grind of machines that didn't care about wellness. We made supplements, vitamins, protein powders, herbal capsules for every big box label that wanted to slap clean on a bottle and mark it up 300%. The FDA called us a contract manufacturer operating under CGMP standards. I called it a barely contained chaos machine with my name taped over half its warning lights. The office wings smelled like old carpet and industrial cleaner that never quite managed to erase the stink of oil and sweat drifting in from the production floor. The closer you got to my cubicle, the more you could taste the air. Processed air conditioning with a hint of dust, printer toner, and the bitter ghost of burned coffee. We had one of those drip machines with a glass carafe that had seen more hours on a hot plate than some of our line workers had seen their kids. The coffee was dark in the pot and darker in the cup, a sludge that hit the tongue like battery acid and mud. First sip every morning, it scraped its way down and left a metallic film on my teeth like I'd been chewing on pennies. We called it regulatory brew. Nobody laughed. We still drank it. Out on the production floor, the smell changed. It was steel and steam, the sweet chalk of vitamin dust, a sharp tang of alcohol from sanitizing sprays, and underneath all of it, the electric scent of machinery, ozone, hot windings, a faint whiff of burning dust inside motor housings. When the big encapsulators spun up, you could feel it in your feet. Stainless steel blenders big enough to hide a car in, tablet presses that could chew through a drum of powder in a heartbeat, blister pack machines, labelers, shrink tunnels. Everything wired into a SCADA system that was older than some of the operators. That was my real office, a windowless control room off the main line, banks of monitors humming, a wall of red, green, and amber lights that told me who was following the rules and who thought the rules didn't apply. My title on paper was Director of Quality Systems and Regulatory Compliance, which sounds like a committee. In practice, I was the kill switch between the plant and the federal government. Every lot, every batch, every shipment over a certain threshold passed across my desk, if not physically, then in its data. I managed the electronic batch record system, the CAPA logs, the training matrix, the internal audit program. I knew where every deviation report was buried, which supervisor fudged line speeds when corporate screamed about throughput, and how many times we'd annotated missing signatures with a neat little per conversation with a note that would make an FDA inspector raise an eyebrow. I didn't let anything ship without a full paper trail, and I slept with 21 CFR Part 111 and 117 regulations practically tattooed on the inside of my skull. The plant was a machine. It ate raw materials and spat out bottles. It also spat out risk. My job was to bolt enough controls onto that risk that we could stay in business without killing anyone. For 20 years, that arrangement mostly held. Then the new VP arrived. His name was Brandon, but he branded himself as Bran on LinkedIn. Vice President of Operations and Digital Transformation. MBA from somewhere with Ivy on it, TEDx talk under his belt, articles in industry magazines about Industry 4 and AI-driven quality. He came in on his first day in slim navy slacks, a fitted vest over a white dress shirt, no tie, loafers with no socks because apparently ankles meant innovation. He wore a watch that cost more than my first car and carried a leather portfolio like he was going to court, not walking into a plant where half the air was vitamin dust. He loved buzzwords the way my line workers loved overtime. In his first all hands, standing in front of the break room's faded safety first poster, he told us we were going to pivot from compliance as a cost center to quality as a velocity enabler. He talked about synergy between operations and data, optimizing optics with regulators, and using AI to unlock invisible capacity. The production supervisors nodded because that's what you do when your paycheck depends on it. The old-timers stared at their coffee like it might save them. He came to see me the second week, strolling into my control room with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He looked around at the monitors like we were a retro arcade. On the wall behind me, we had a big laminated flowchart of our internal audit schedule and a whiteboard full of scribbled lot numbers. "This is where the magic happens, huh?" he said, leaning on the door frame so his loafers wouldn't cross the threshold. I told him this was where the paperwork for the magic happened, and without it, the feds would shut us down in a heartbeat. He waved a hand and said we could do better than sweat and binders. He had a plan. The plan involved AI, of course it did. He'd signed a glossy contract with a startup that promised AI-driven GMP compliance. They had a logo with a stylized brain in blue. Their pitch deck talked about natural language processing of batch records, predictive deviation detection, and automated audit readiness. They called their system QInsight. I called it dangerous. We already had an electronic batch record system. Ugly, yes, old, absolutely, but it worked. It enforced signatures, timestamps, required fields. It wasn't pretty, but it had been validated within an inch of its life. This new thing wanted to sit on top of it, scrape data, and start flagging anomalies without anyone who'd ever survived a 483 writing the rules. Brandon brought the vendor in, two guys barely old enough to rent a car. They wore black jeans, white sneakers, and company t-shirts under blazers. They used words like velocity, insights, and frictionless until I wanted to throw my coffee at the screen. They showed him a demo of their AI reading a batch record and spotting a missing signature. Brandon looked like he'd seen God. I pointed out that my current system already did that. The vendor said their AI could also correlate patterns in deviations and suggest process changes. I asked who would be on the hook legally when their suggestions went sideways. They said something about shared responsibility and partnership. I told them FDA inspectors didn't cite shared responsibility, they cited companies. The more I asked questions, the more I became resistant. Brandon started looping me out of emails. He set up a digital transformation task force with production, IT, and his pet data analyst, but no one from quality. He told people loudly that quality was too rooted in fear to drive change. In meetings, he'd say, "We respect compliance," then follow it with, "But we can't let it strangle velocity." I'd been called worse by better people. Here's the thing Brandon never bothered to read: our consent decree. Back in the early 2000s, before my hair started going gray at the temples, the plant got slapped with a warning letter. Mislabeling, incomplete batch records, unreported deviations. It was ugly. We narrowly avoided a shutdown by entering into a consent decree with the FDA, essentially a probation agreement. We agreed to implement a specific internal audit program, maintain a certain documentation system, and have an independent quality unit that signed off on every release. We also agreed that any significant change to our quality systems had to be reviewed as part of an annual independent audit. The consent decree defined that audit in excruciating detail, down to the sampling method for batch records. It was the reason my job existed as it did. I became, over time, not just director of quality systems, but the person who coordinated that independent audit and signed the final internal compliance report that went to the FDA annually. My lever, the kill switch I never wanted but always had, wasn't a USB drive or a magic password. It was my name on a line. The consent decree stipulated that the annual internal audit report, summarizing our adherence to CGMP and the decree terms, had to be signed by an independent quality officer with at least 10 years of documented experience and no direct reporting line into operations. That was me, 26 years in, reporting to the CEO, not operations. If that report wasn't filed, or if it was filed without proper basis, the FDA had the explicit right to seek a court order closing the plant. Not reviewing, not fine, not slap on the wrist. Close. As in locked doors, marshals at the gate. Brandon didn't read the decree. He skimmed a summary in a PowerPoint once and decided it was ancient history. When he pitched QInsight to the CEO, he sold it as our way out of consent decree land. He promised that AI would make us best in class, audit-ready 24/7, all the usual nonsense. The CEO, who was tired, overweight, and had started talking about the exit like it was heaven, let himself be sold. He told me in his office, framed by a bookshelf full of regulatory binders, that we needed to keep an open mind about the AI. I told him I'd keep an open mind as long as someone read the consent decree language about validated systems and independent review. He waved me off, said legal had blessed it. What legal had blessed, I later discovered, was the contract with QInsight, not the implementation plan. The plan was a mess. Brandon wanted to feed years of batch records into the AI, train it on their text, and then start letting it approve low-risk lots without human review. He talked about freeing my team up for value-added tasks. I pictured an FDA investigator sitting across from me asking why our deviation investigations now included phrases like "as predicted by model." I wrote a 4-page memo outlining exactly why we couldn't skip human review, how Part 11 and Part 111 required actual signatures and justification, not just model confidence scores. He didn't read it, I know, because he forwarded it to it with "Can you make this less fear-based?" in the header. The day he told me the AI was replacing me, we were in yet another meeting in the stale conference room we called the war room back when we still cared about metaphor. The room smelled like dry erase markers and the ghost of 1,000 Subway sandwiches. The coffee in there was older than some inspectors. Brandon brought a fancy cold brew in a glass bottle, label facing out, optics. He laid out his new org. Quality systems would be collapsed into operational excellence. QInsight would handle routine compliance checks. My role would evolve into advisor for a few months and then sunset. He used sunset like he was talking about a beach, not my livelihood. I reminded him about the consent decree. He smiled, that PR smile that never touched his eyes, and said he'd spoken to legal. They'd interpret the requirement for an independent audit to include AI-generated reports overseen by a committee. The word interpret did a lot of lifting in that sentence. I asked who would sign the annual report. He said the CEO would. I asked if the CEO had 10 years of quality experience. He said it was that literal. I told him the FDA usually was. He told me I was stuck in an obsolete paradigm and that optics-wise we can't keep telling the board we're reliant on one person's signature. That's about the only thing they did right. The HR manager, a woman who had sat in on more disciplinary meetings than weddings, read from a script about restructuring and realigning to strategic priorities. Brandon sat beside her in a crisp white shirt, navy vest, and those same sockless loafers, looking like a catalog man for Executive 2. He said something about how they truly valued my contributions, but the industry was pivoting. I asked when my last day was. End of month, HR said, 2 weeks. They handed me a packet with severance figures that made me want to spit coffee. No mention of the consent decree, no mention of the annual audit. You'll be transitioning your responsibilities to the new system and the Ops Excellence team, Brandon said. I asked who on that team had ever sat across from an FDA investigator in a 483 closeout meeting. He looked blank. HR shifted in her seat. I signed their papers because not signing wouldn't change anything. As I left, I asked him if he'd ever actually read the decree. He smiled and said, "We can't be ruled by fear." I said, "Good luck explaining that to the feds." I took my coffee mug, stained and chipped. I left the red binder. The red binder was my other kill switch. On its spine, in fading Sharpie, it said Internal Audit Master. Inside were 5 years of my internal audit plans, checklists, sample reports, and notes. Every audit I'd run to satisfy the decree was documented in there. I digitized most of it, sure, but the physical binder was what I brought into meetings when I needed to show history. I flagged it with a sticky note, 2023 Audit Plan Incomplete, because it was. I'd started that year's internal audit cycle, hit 3 manufacturing areas, and flagged 2 critical deviations where line leads had forgotten to log rejected tablets. Both CAPAs were still open. The binder had my notes, detailed, dated, with follow-up tasks. I wrote one more note on the inside cover. Annual report cannot be signed based on incomplete audit. DC, Director QSRC. Then I left it on my chair. They disabled my badge at 5:03 p.m. the same day. You never forget the sound of a card reader going from green to red for you. It's like a heart monitor flatlining. I walked out past reception, tasted the last of the battery acid coffee coating my tongue, and stepped into air that didn't smell like dust and disinfectant. I went home and slept for 12 hours without dreaming about batch numbers. We were in Q3. The annual internal audit report for the consent decree was due 6 weeks later. For the first month, I heard nothing. It was almost eerie. I woke up, made coffee that didn't taste like boiled regrets, and tried to remember what people did when they weren't tethered to a machine's heartbeat. I took a walk without my phone. I sat on my back porch and listened to birds instead of compressors. Sometimes I felt a phantom vibration on my wrist where my watch used to buzz with production alerts. Ghosts in the nervous system. The first crack came from a friend still inside. She texted me at 2 a.m. a photo of a red screen, the SCADA alarm panel lit up like Christmas. New AI thing turned off purge alarm for line 3, her message said. Overheated hopper, powder caked. We almost had a fire. QInsight had decided, based on patterns, that a temperature alarm was nuisance during setup. It had learned that operators often acknowledged the alarm and did nothing. So it started auto-silencing them for that phase to reduce noise. Nobody had told the machine that sometimes noise is the only thing between you and an OSHA report. A week later, she wrote again. We got a 483. 2 observations. The FDA had shown up for a routine inspection and found exactly what I would have predicted. Incomplete deviation investigations, changes to batch record workflows without proper validation, and an AI engine generating summary reports that no one could explain clearly. Inspectors don't like black boxes, they like blood, sweat, and ink. Someone had tried to tell them the AI was augmenting quality. The investigator had written in neat red ink, firm relies on automated system without documented validation or adequate human oversight. He told the floor it was just a few minor observations and that optics-wise we can spin this as a modernization issue. The phrase made its way back to me through the grapevine. I laughed so hard I spilled my decent coffee. Then Q4 rolled around and the annual audit report came due. Under the consent decree, the company had to send a report to the FDA every year summarizing its internal audit program, major findings, CAPAs, and an overall assessment of compliance. It had to be signed by the independent quality officer and the CEO. They'd pushed my name off the org chart. That didn't rewrite the decree. Brandon and operations tried to push the new ops excellence lead into the line, but legal balked. No 10 years of quality experience. Reporting line wrong. They could petition the FDA for a change, but that took time and evidence. They didn't have either. They tried to cheat. They had the AI generate audit summaries by scraping batch records and deviation logs, then stapled on a cover sheet with the CEO's signature. They didn't mention in the cover letter that there had been no full internal audit conducted according to the plan. They didn't mention the red binder on my old chair. They sent it off and hoped nobody would read too closely. Someone read. The FDA's Office of Compliance flagged the report. It didn't match the format and depth of prior years. The language was too generic, too insightful. It read like marketing copy that had been taught GMP vocabulary. They cross-checked dates, saw open deviations still unresolved, CAPAs unfinished, and a glaring gap, no documented audits of blending and compression lines in the last cycle. That violated the decree. They sent a letter. Legal called it a request for clarification. My friend inside sent me photos. The word noncompliance was underlined twice. I'd done enough of these to see where it was heading. The agency doesn't move fast until it does. First letters, then meetings, then, if you're stubborn or stupid, enforcement. Brandon managed to be both. He flew to DC with the CEO and someone from legal. They brought a polished slide deck about AI-driven quality maturity. They brought testimonials from the QInsight vendor. They talked about embracing innovation while honoring compliance. The FDA brought the decree and my old reports. They asked where the internal audit documentation was for the last year. Brandon said the AI had digested it. The FDA asked who had independently verified its output. Brandon said the Ops Excellence team. The FDA asked where that team's qualifications were documented. Brandon smiled his PR smile. The FDA did not. When they came back, my phone rang, not from Brandon, from the CEO. He sounded the way people sound when a doctor says the word tumor. He told me flatly that the FDA had expressed concerns about our compliance and that they were considering more serious action under the decree. He said they'd asked pointed questions about why the named independent quality officer, me, had been removed and how they could be sure the internal audit program still functioned as represented. He said my name had come up more than once. Then he asked carefully if I would consider helping them understand our history, not for free, of course. He knew better than that. I told him I'd be willing to serve as an external consultant advising on consent decree compliance and internal audits. I quoted my rate, $10,000 an hour with a $200,000 retainer wired in advance. I wanted full indemnity, a clause stating I'd previously documented concerns about AI replacing validated processes and the freedom to walk if they tried to spin my involvement as endorsement of Brandon's circus. He didn't argue, he was scared, that was new. The wire hit my account the next morning. I watched the numbers tick up on my bank app with my second cup of decent coffee, which tasted less like mud and more like chocolate. Then I drove back to the plant for the first time in 2 months. Walking through those doors as an outsider was surreal. The lobby smelled the same, disinfectant and stale air. The guard at the desk did a double take before recognizing me. My visitor badge was bright red instead of blue. Consultant. The plant air hit me as soon as I crossed into production. Steam, alcohol, vitamin dust, steel. The control room hummed like it remembered me. The coffee machine burbled in the break room, serving the same battery acid as always. Nothing had changed and everything had. The war room meeting was packed. CEO, legal, operations, 2 people from the QInsight vendor, and Brandon looking a shade paler, his vest a darker gray. He looked at me like I was a ghost. Maybe I was. The independent quality officer they'd tried to bury coming back with a contract and a retainer. They wanted me to tell them how to convince the FDA to back off. Instead, I told them how to tell the truth. I laid out what the consent decree actually required: documented internal audits, experienced human review, validated systems, independence from operations. I showed them my historical audit plans and reports, scanned from the red binder I'd had the foresight to copy. I pointed to the gaps in the last year. I explained, in language even Brandon could understand, that an AI could support audits but not replace them, not without explicit regulatory acceptance they did not have. I told them that sending that annual report without a real audit had been a gift-wrapped invitation for enforcement. Legal asked carefully what I thought the FDA would do. I told them honestly that it depended on how contrite they were and how much patience the agency had left after years of babysitting. The worst-case scenario was spelled out in the decree: motion in federal court to halt operations until compliance was restored with the possibility of product seizures. A plant closure. The words hung in the air like dust motes. Brandon tried to salvage his image. He talked about intent, about driving modernization, about how our optics would suffer if we backed away from AI innovation. I watched the CEO's mouth tighten as he spoke. The man looked like someone had deflated him. He cut Brandon off mid-optics and asked me what we needed to do that week. We burned through the retainer in 6 days. I put together an emergency internal audit plan, triaging the highest-risk areas, blending, compression, packaging. I trained a hastily assembled team on how to actually audit instead of just check boxes. We documented deviations properly, assigned CAPAs with real root cause analysis instead of operator error, and validated the AI system's outputs against manual reviews. It failed often enough that even the vendor stopped smiling. We prepared a corrective action plan for the FDA, acknowledging that we jumped ahead of our skis. I drafted the cover letter. The CEO signed it with a hand that trembled slightly. The FDA's response was swift and cold. The letter arrived on a Thursday. I was sitting in the control room, flipping through batch records that smelled faintly of toner and panic when legal walked in with a piece of certified mail like it was a subpoena from God. The agency appreciated our candor, they said. They appreciated our corrective action plan. They did not, however, appreciate that we had violated the consent decree by removing the independent quality officer and implementing unvalidated systems. They were moving to enforce the U.S. Attorney's office would be seeking an injunction to halt operations at the plant until compliance was demonstrably restored. In plain English, they were coming to close the plant. You could feel the panic seep into the concrete. Production meetings turned into group therapy. Supervisors whispered about layoffs. HR held town halls where they said words like contingency plans and transition support. Brandon disappeared from the floor. Word spread that he was helping with strategy, which is corporate for upstairs figuring out how big their parachute is. The machinists asked me quietly if this was the end. I told them plants close and plants reopen. Machines can be moved, people are the real assets. It didn't help much, but it was true. The day the feds came, it felt like a storm rolling in. 2 FDA investigators in blue jackets, a U.S. Marshal, clipboards, cameras. They walked through the plant with the solemn efficiency of people who'd done this before. They posted a notice at the main entrance. By order of the U.S. District Court, operations at this facility are hereby suspended. It fluttered in the air-conditioned breeze. The machines were shut down one line at a time. The smell of steam faded. The sound of whirring motors died. For the first time in my career, I heard that plant go still. It was like listening to a heart stop. Harsh, some might say, necessary, I would argue. For years, we danced on the edge of compliance, relying on people like me to keep us from falling. Brandon had decided he could replace caution with code. The machine disagreed. They fired him the next week, not with a press release. People like him don't get public hangings. They get an email that says Brandon has decided to pursue other opportunities. The rumors said his severance came with a gag order, a non-disparagement clause, and a polite suggestion never to use the phrase AI-driven compliance in front of a regulator again. The CEO retired earlier than he'd planned. The board brought in a turnaround firm. Part of their plan was to rebuild quality from the bones up. They asked me to stay on as an advisor, long-term this time, not just crisis triage. I renegotiated my contract, a standing retainer that would make my younger self choke. $200,000 a quarter plus hourly at my now standard rate for on-site work. No benefits, no HR, no org chart, freedom at last in the cracks of a broken machine. Sometimes I walk through the silent plant with a hard hat under my arm and a marshal's tape still hanging in the corners. It smells different now, less steam, more dust, like a kitchen between dinner shifts. The coffee in the break room got swapped for pods at some point, but it still tastes like burnt plastic. The servers in the back hum on minimal power, backing up records for lawyers and auditors. The red binder sits on my desk in the control room, not because I need it anymore, I have everything digitized, but because it reminds me what my real job has always been. Not keeping machines running, telling the truth about what happens when they do. They called him a visionary. He replaced human judgment with an algorithm and thought he'd outsmarted the rulebook. My internal audit, stripped of any intention to protect him, flagged exactly what it was supposed to flag. The feds did their job. The plant fell silent. And I got paid more in 6 months as an external consultant than I had in the last 5 years on salary to explain the same regulations I'd been quoting over lukewarm sludge coffee for decades. The machine is still there. Maybe one day it will spin up again under new ownership, new names on the doors, new vests in the conference room. Maybe it won't. That's above my pay grade now. My loyalty was never to the logo on the letterhead. It was to the people who had to swallow what came out of those bottles. And if I'm honest, a little bit to the part of me that likes seeing arrogance meet physics and law at the same time. The plant closed. The visionary left. The AI got boxed up and sent back to whatever incubator spat it out. I kept my red binder, my rate, and my ability to sleep at night. In this business, that's as close to a happy ending as you get.